The air in the chamber was cold enough to raise goosebumps on bare arms, but no one present was wearing anything casual. Rows of polished obsidian seats curved upward in a half circle, each occupied by a figure in formal dress uniforms representing Earth's unified defense branches. At the center of the room, two men stood several feet apart, their postures rigid, their eyes locked straight ahead rather than at each other. Between them, a single drop of blood stained the polished floor, a tiny crimson mark that seemed to pulse with significance under the sterile white lights. One man wore the charcoal gray armor of the Galactic Defense Force, its surface etched with faint silver lines marking deep space deployments. The other stood in the matte black tactical gear of Earth's Naval Special Warfare Division, the fabric worn soft at the shoulders from years of hard use. They had not been told to stand so close together. The arrangement had been deliberate, a decision made upstairs to encourage reflection. It was having the opposite effect an hour earlier. This had been a routine debriefing, a joint mission to secure an abandoned research outpost on Europa's icy surface. Standard procedure: GDF providing orbital support and heavy extraction, naval operators handling ground infiltration. The kind of cooperation that looked good on planning documents. In practice, it had unraveled within 90 minutes of boots touching ice. The trouble started when the naval team moved ahead of schedule, ignoring 3 separate comms warnings about unstable terrain beneath the outpost's foundation. They'd found their targeted data core humming softly in a frozen lab, but triggered a cascade failure in the station's aging support systems. Alarms blared, emergency seals slammed shut, and the GDF trooper, who'd been positioned at the extraction point exactly as ordered, found himself cut off from his own team while the Jintinsmades naval operators remained trapped inside with their prize. What happened next would be argued over for weeks. The official log showed a 17-second gap in all communications. The GDF trooper would later state he'd heard shouting panicked voices from the naval team claiming the walls were buckling. He made a choice. Against direct orders to hold position, he forced his way through a sealed bulkhead using controlled demolition charges. He reached the operators just as a support beam groaned overhead, seconds from collapse. He shoved a lead naval operator clear. The beam came down anyway, missing the man, but pinning the trooper's leg beneath half a ton of composite metal. The rescue took 22 minutes. By the time medics freed him, the trooper's face was pale with shock, his uniform soaked through with sweat. The naval team stood nearby, data core secured, untouched by injury. One of them muttered something about unnecessary heroics while waiting for evac. The trooper heard it. Everyone in the cramped shuttle heard it. Back on Earth, the incident report should have ended there. A messy operation with a positive outcome, data recovered. All personnel returned alive. But pride is a quiet poison. During the preliminary hearing 2 days later, the lead naval operator stood before the review board and described the GDF trooper's actions as reckless improvisation that endangered the entire mission timeline. He spoke calmly, professionally, as if discussing weather patterns. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that the trooper's decision to breach the bulkhead had nearly caused a total station collapse. That part wasn't in any sensor log. The trooper sat in the back of the hearing room, leg still wrapped in a compression brace. He said nothing as the officer finished his statement. He simply stood, walked slowly to the front of the room, and stopped directly in front of the naval operator. For 3 full seconds, neither man moved. Then the trooper raised his hand, not in a fist, but open-palmed, and tapped the officer once firmly on the center of his chest. The sound was sharp in the silent room. Not an attack, a punctuation mark. A question asked without words. Do you hear yourself? The naval operator didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed. And in that moment, something broke between them, not bones or skin, but the fragile understanding the men who fight beside each other are supposed to share. The council chamber fell into a silence so deep you could hear the hum of the climate control system. No one moved to separate them. No one shouted. The damage was already done now. Standing before the full disciplinary council, both men understood the stakes. This wasn't really about Europa anymore. It was about whose version of events would become the official truth. The GDF command wanted the trooper to apologize for insubordination, the unauthorized breach, the confrontation in the hearing room. Naval Command wanted their operator to stand firm, to uphold the narrative that discipline had saved the mission. Both branches were watching. Both careers hung in the balance. The lead council member, an aging general with a face lined by decades of impossible choices, finally broke the silence. "You both volunteered for service knowing the risks," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "You trained to trust the person beside you when things go wrong. Yet here you stand, unable to look each other in the eye after one difficult night on an ice moon. Explain to me how this serves Earth." The trooper's jaw tightened. He wanted to speak about the sound the station made as it began to tear itself apart, the deep, grinding shriek of metal surrendering to pressure. He wanted to describe the fear in the younger naval operator's eyes when the beams started to fall, a fear that vanished the moment safety was assured, replaced by cool professionalism. He wanted to say that courage isn't always loud or dramatic. It's sometimes just a decision made in 17 seconds of silence, when no one is watching, but he stayed quiet. Because he understood something the council might not. This wasn't a trial about right and wrong. It was about pride wearing different uniforms. And pride, he had learned on Europa, doesn't care which side wears the armor. It only cares that it wins. The naval operator shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. His hands, clasped behind his back, flexed once. He was thinking about the data core they'd recovered, information that might prevent a future catastrophe. He was thinking about timelines and protocols and the cold reality that sentiment doesn't save lives. He believed, truly believed, that following procedure was its own form of courage. That sometimes you have to let a man make his own choices, even if those choices lead to pain. Neither man was entirely wrong, and neither was entirely right. The council would have to decide which truth mattered more. But as the general began his questioning, both soldiers knew the real judgment had already been passed, not by officers in polished chairs, but in that frozen moment on Europa when one man chose to move toward danger while another waited for orders. Some divides, once created, cannot be bridged by apologies or reprimands. They simply remain a hairline fracture in the foundation of trust, waiting for the next pressure to test whether the whole structure will hold. The council chamber felt smaller with each passing minute. The general's question hung in the air like smoke, no one rushing to clear it away. The trooper kept his gaze fixed on a point just above the general's shoulder, focusing on the slow rhythm of his own breathing. Inhale for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Exhale for 6. A trick learned during long watches in deep space when panic tried to creep in through the silence. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, the stiff-backed admirals from Naval Command, the stone-faced colonels from his own branch, civilians in dark suits who took notes without looking up. All of them waiting for someone to break first. The naval operator finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone used to explain complex procedures to new recruits. "Sir, the mission parameters were clear. We had a timeline. We had extraction windows. Deviating from that timeline put the entire operation at risk." He paused, just long enough for the words to settle. What happened on Europa was unfortunate, but emotion has no place in tactical decisions. The trooper's fingers twitched at his sides. He didn't look at the man speaking. He didn't need to. He could picture the exact expression, the slight tightening around the eyes, the way the jaw stayed perfectly still while words came out smooth and practiced. He'd seen that look before, years ago, on a different world. A village elder standing in the ashes of his home after an insurgent attack, speaking politely to relief workers while his hands trembled at his sides. Same composure, different kind of breaking. I wasn't acting on emotion, the trooper said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. I heard the structural stress alarms. I saw the pressure readings drop on my display. That station was coming down in less than a minute. Waiting for permission would have meant leaving good people behind. Good people follow protocol, the naval operator replied without turning his head. Protocol exists because it works. Because it keeps everyone alive, not just the ones making split-second decisions for the sake of feeling heroic. A muscle jumped in the trooper's cheek. He remembered the younger member of the naval team, the one with nervous hands, who fumbled with his rifle during the approach. That same young operator had been the one closest to the falling beam, the one he'd shoved out of the way. Afterward, during the shuttle ride home, the young man had tried to catch his eye twice. Both times, the lead operator had subtly shifted position, blocking the contact. A small thing, the kind of thing command would never log in an official report. But the trooper had noticed. He'd spent too many years watching for the small tells, the shifts in posture, the avoided glances, the quiet ways people protect each other or shut each other down. The general leaned forward slightly. You both recovered the data core. You both returned alive. By the numbers, this was a successful mission. So why are we here? Silence stretched again. This time it felt heavier. The trooper made a decision. He turned his head, just enough to look directly at the naval operator for the first time since entering the chamber. Not with anger, not with challenge, just with a quiet, steady attention that seemed to catch the other man off guard. I'm here because I heard you tell the preliminary board that I endangered your team, the trooper said. His voice stayed even. But that's not what happened. Your youngest operator, the one on his third deployment, he looked me in the eye after we got back to the shuttle. He didn't say anything, but he nodded, just once. And I knew he was thanking me. The naval operator's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. Personal impressions don't override mission logs. Maybe not, the trooper agreed, but they matter. When you're trapped under a collapsed beam with ice cracking beneath your feet, you don't think about protocol. You think about whether the person next to you will stay or run. I stayed, not for glory, not to be a hero, because running wasn't an option. He paused, letting the words sink in. And I'm not here to destroy your reputation. I'm here because what you said in that hearing room, it wasn't true. And when soldiers start rewriting what happened to fit a narrative, we stop being able to trust each other when things go wrong. And things always go wrong. A woman in the second row, an admiral with silver streaks running through her dark hair, shifted in her seat. She'd been silent until now, observing. You're both skilled operators, she said, her voice softer than the others, but carrying just as much authority. You've both served with distinction. So help me understand. Why does this feel personal? The naval operator finally turned his head. Just a few degrees. Enough for the trooper to see the exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying weight no one else can see. Because it is personal, the operator said quietly. Last year, I lost 2 people under my command. Good operators. They died because someone decided to improvise to be the hero in a situation that required patience. I watched their families receive folded flags. I listened to their parents ask why their children didn't come home. Since then, I follow protocol. Not because I enjoy it, but because it's the only thing that keeps the math working in our favor. The confession landed softly in the room. No dramatic music. No sudden shift in lighting. Just a man admitting, in front of strangers, that his rigidity came from grief. The trooper felt something loosen in his chest. He'd been so focused on defending his own actions that he hadn't considered what might be driving the other man's stance. He thought about his own losses, the friends whose names he still spoke aloud on quiet nights, the empty bunks that never got filled again. He thought about how grief wears different uniforms, but always carries the same weight. "I'm sorry about your team," the trooper said. The words felt inadequate, but he meant them. "I've stood where you stood. It changes you." The operator gave a single, slow nod. Not agreement. Not forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. The general watched the exchange carefully. He'd seen this dance before, pride and pain circling each other like tired fighters in a ring. He knew the official outcome would be written in reports and filed away. But the real resolution, if it happened at all, would occur in moments like this. Quiet, unrecorded, human. "Here is what I see," the general said after a long moment. Two good soldiers who made different choices under pressure. Both choices had merit. Both carried risk. Neither was perfect. But somewhere between Europa and this room, the mission stopped being about recovering data and started being about whose version of events would win. He let that settle over them. "You both know the regulations. You both know the consequences of insubordination and of misrepresenting facts in official testimony. I could write reprimands. I could recommend reassignment. I could make examples of you both to remind every soldier under my command that discipline matters." He paused, looking at each man in turn. "Or I could ask you to do something harder. Something that actually matters." The trooper waited. The naval operator waited. The entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. "Before you leave this room," the general continued, "I want you to look at each other. Not as representatives of rival branches. Not as adversaries in a hearing. But as two human beings who've seen too much and lost too much. And I want you to find one thing, just one thing you can respect about the other person's choice on that ice moon." Silence returned, but this time it felt different. Less like a standoff. More like an invitation. The trooper looked at the naval operator properly for the first time. He saw the tension in his neck, the careful control in his posture, the way his hands stayed perfectly still behind his back. He saw a man who carried his losses like armor. And the operator, after a moment, let his eyes meet the trooper's. He saw the faint scar above his eyebrow, the slight limp he tried to hide, the quiet steadiness in his stance that spoke of years spent making hard calls alone in the dark. Neither man spoke right away, but something in the space between them had shifted. Not fixed, not healed, but changed. Like ice beginning to thaw, not all at once, but with the first faint promise that spring might still come. The trooper took a slow breath. The general's request hung in the air, simple on the surface but heavy underneath. Finding something to respect that wasn't the same as agreeing. It wasn't surrender. It was something harder. It meant looking past the uniform, past the pride, and seeing the person underneath. He studied the naval operator's face again. Really looked this time. Not as an opponent in a hearing room, but as another soldier who'd walked through fire and come out changed. He noticed the faint lines around the man's eyes, not from age, but from squinting into sunrises on distant shores, from scanning horizons for threats no one else could see. He saw the way the man's shoulders carried weight, not just a physical load of gear, but something deeper, something earned. "I respect that you care about your team," the trooper said finally. His voice was quiet but clear in the still room. "I saw it on the shuttle ride back. You kept checking on the younger one, the one who almost got hit by that beam. You didn't say much, but you made sure he had water, made sure his gear was stowed properly. You were looking after him even when you thought no one was watching. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I don't agree with how you described what happened on Europa, but I understand why you hold on to protocol so tightly. After losing people, you start believing that if everyone just follows the plan, no one else has to die. I get that. I've been there too. The words landed softly. The naval operator didn't respond right away. His gaze dropped to the floor for a moment, then rose again to meet the trooper's eyes. Something had shifted behind them, not forgiveness, not yet, but the first crack in a wall that had been built too quickly. The operator began, his voice slightly rougher than before. He cleared his throat. I respect that you didn't hesitate. When that beam started to fall, most people would have frozen, even trained operators. But you moved. You put yourself in danger without calculating the odds, without waiting for permission. He hesitated, then added, that kind of instinct. It saves lives. I've seen it save lives before. I worry what happens when that instinct overrides everything else. The trooper gave a small nod. It's a balance, he said. Instinct without discipline gets people killed. Discipline without instinct gets people killed too. I learned that the hard way early in my career. Watched a good soldier follow orders straight into an ambush because he was too afraid to trust what his gut was telling him. A faint sound came from the back of the chamber, a soft exhalation from one of the observers. No one had moved or spoken until now, but the tension in the room had visibly softened. The two men weren't allies yet, but they weren't enemies anymore either. They were just two people who'd made different choices under pressure, both trying to do what they thought was right. The general watched them carefully. He'd served long enough to recognize genuine moments when they happened. This wasn't theater. It wasn't two soldiers reciting lines they'd been coached to say. This was something messier and more valuable, real human connection breaking through layers of training and trauma. Good, the general said after a moment. That's a start. But starts aren't enough. Not for what comes next. He stood slowly, the weight of his years evident in the careful way he rose from his chair. He walked down the 2 steps to the chamber floor, stopping halfway between the two men. Up close, they could see the faint scar running along his jawline, the silver threading through his close-cropped hair, the calm steadiness in his eyes that only comes from decades of making impossible choices. Tomorrow morning, he said, you'll both report to Training Facility 7. You'll be assigned to lead a mixed team of GDF recruits and naval trainees through a 48-hour field exercise. No officers overseeing you. No safety nets. Just the two of you, responsible for 20 raw recruits in simulated combat conditions. A ripple of surprise moved through the observers. This wasn't standard procedure. Joint disciplinary actions usually meant reprimands, extra duty, maybe temporary reassignment. Not putting two conflicted soldiers in direct command of trainees together. The naval operator spoke first. Sir, with respect that seems unwise. I know what you've just done, the general interrupted gently. You've taken the first step toward understanding each other. Now you need to take the next step, learning to work together. Because out there, he gestured vaguely toward the ceiling, toward the stars beyond. The next crisis won't care about branch rivalries or personal pride. It will care whether the people sent to handle it can set aside their differences and function as one unit. He looked at each man in turn. You both believe your way is the right way. Fine, prove it. Not by arguing in hearing rooms. Not by filing reports. But by showing these recruits what real leadership looks like when two different philosophies have to share the same ground. The trooper felt a strange mix of apprehension and something else, something like hope. He'd spent his career believing that action mattered more than words. And this was action. A chance to show, not tell. to demonstrate that instinct and discipline weren't enemies. They were partners. That sometimes you follow the plan, and sometimes the plan needs to bend because the situation demands it. The naval operator seemed to be having a similar realization. His expression shifted from resistance to thoughtful consideration. He'd spent so long clinging to procedure as a shield against chaos that he'd forgotten procedure exists to serve people, not the other way around. Maybe, just maybe, there was room for both approaches. Not compromise. Integration. The general turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "One more thing," he said without looking back. "Those recruits? They don't know about Europa. They don't know about your conflict. To them, you're just two senior operators assigned to test their readiness. Don't make it about you. Make it about them. Because that's what real leaders do. They put the mission and the people ahead of their own egos." Then he was gone, leaving the two men standing alone in the center of the chamber. For a long moment, neither spoke. The observers began gathering their notes, filing out quietly through side doors, leaving the space to the two soldiers. The hum of the ventilation system filled the silence between them. Finally, the naval operator broke the quiet. 48 hours, he said, with raw recruits. No oversight. Sounds like fun, the trooper replied, a faint hint of dry humor in his voice. A corner of the operator's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. You planning to follow the exercise parameters? Or improvise again? The trooper considered the question seriously. I'll follow the parameters that keep people safe. I'll improvise when the situation demands it. Same as you would. The operator studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. We should review the terrain maps tonight. Facility 7 has that ravine on the eastern edge, the one that floods during simulated rainfall cycles. We'll need to account for that in our patrol rotations. It was a small thing, just tactical planning. But it was the first collaborative sentence either of them had spoken since stepping onto Europa's ice. Yeah, the trooper agreed. And we should check the weather forecast for the exercise window. Last time I ran that course, unexpected fog rolled in and disoriented half the squad. The operator nodded again, more firmly this time. My quarters are yours. We can spread the maps out on the table. Yours, the trooper said. I've got a datapad with updated satellite overlays. I'll bring it. A simple exchange. Practical. Professional. But underneath the words ran something new, a current of mutual respect. Fragile but real. They weren't friends. They might never be. But they were starting to understand that their differences didn't have to divide them. That sometimes the strongest teams aren't made of people who think alike, but of people who think differently and choose to listen anyway. As they walked out of the chamber together, still not side by side, but no longer rigidly apart. Neither man knew what the next 48 hours would bring. They only knew they'd been given a rare second chance, not to prove who was right, but to discover what they could build together when pride stepped aside and purpose took its place. And somewhere deep down, both of them hoped, without admitting it aloud, that they might just surprise each other. The training facility spread out before them like a scar across the landscape, rolling hills cut by narrow ravines. Patches of dense forest giving way to open fields dotted with abandoned structures from decades-old military exercises. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, a world away from the sterile chambers where their conflict had begun. 20 recruits stood in two uneven lines, their postures betraying a mix of nervous energy and forced confidence. Some wore the charcoal gray training fatigues of the Galactic Defense Force. Others stood in the dark, navy blues of naval special warfare. They hadn't been told to separate themselves, but old habits ran deep. And the division had formed naturally before either senior operator had even arrived. The trooper and the naval operator stood side by side at the front of the group. a deliberate choice neither had discussed but both had made. The night before had changed something between them. Hours bent over terrain maps in the operator's quarters, debating patrol routes and contingency plans, had stripped away some of the stiffness. They discovered they both took their coffee black. They both lost a parent young. They both, at different points in their careers, questioned whether they were cut out for this life. Small things. Human things. The kind that don't show up in service records but matter more than any medal. "Listen up," the naval operator said, his voice carrying easily across the open ground. The recruits snapped to sharper attention. For the next 48 hours, this area becomes a contested zone. Your objective: secure and hold the communications relay at the center of the map for a minimum of 6 consecutive hours. He paused, letting the simplicity of the mission sink in. The complication: you won't know which of you are on the same team until you reach the first checkpoint. Half of you will receive orders to defend the relay. The other half will be ordered to capture it. You'll only learn your assignment when you arrive. A murmur rippled through the group. The trooper stepped forward then, his presence calmer but no less commanding. There are no referees out here. No safety officers watching from towers. If you make a mistake, you'll feel the consequences simulated, but real enough to teach you something. We won't rescue you from poor decisions, but we also won't let anyone get truly hurt. That's the line we walk. Understand? Heads nodded. Eyes stayed locked forward. But he saw the flicker of uncertainty in a few faces, the ones still trying to figure out who to trust. The operator continued. You have 2 hours of daylight to reach the first checkpoint. Move out in 5 minutes. You decide your own formation. We'll be observing. We won't interfere unless lives are a genuine risk. The recruits scattered immediately into motion, grabbing packs, checking gear, forming small clusters based on branch loyalty. The trooper watched them go, then turned to the operator. They're splitting along branch lines already. Just like we did. Old habits, the operator replied, his gaze following the retreating figures. But they'll learn faster than we did. Or they'll fail. Either way, they'll learn. They moved out behind the recruits, staying far enough back to observe without influencing. For the first hour, the exercise unfolded predictably. The GDF trainees favored wide, sweeping movements, securing high ground, establishing overlapping fields of view, moving with the confidence of soldiers trained for open terrain and orbital support that would never come. The naval trainees stayed low, using cover expertly, moving in tight pairs, communicating with hand signals developed for coastal infiltrations and urban environments. Both approaches had merit. Both had blind spots. The first real test came at the ravine, the same one they discussed the night before. Simulated rainfall had turned the narrow passage into a slick, muddy chute with water rushing ankle-deep along the bottom. The lead GDF recruit, a broad-shouldered young man with the easy confidence of someone who'd excelled in every test so far, called for the group to cross directly through the center. The naval operator tensed almost imperceptibly. The trooper noticed. He's ignoring the current, the trooper murmured. That water is moving faster than it looks. Before the operator could respond, one of the naval trainees, a smaller woman with sharp eyes, stepped forward. Sir, with respect, the eastern bank has more stable footing. The rocks there haven't shifted as much. We could cross there with less risk of someone losing their footing. The GDF recruit barely glanced at her. We're losing daylight. Straight across is fastest. The trooper and operator exchanged a look. This was the moment. The exact kind of situation that had divided them on Europa. Protocol versus instinct. Speed versus caution. The operator started to step forward, but the trooper placed a light hand on his arm. Just for a second. A silent message. Let them work it out. The naval trainee didn't back down. Fast doesn't matter if someone gets swept downstream. Then we lose time pulling them out. And gear. And momentum. Another GDF recruit spoke up then, hesitantly. She's got a point. My cousin did river training last year. Said current looks harmless until it isn't. A debate broke out, not hostile but earnest. Voices overlapping, pointing at different parts of the ravine, weighing options. The original leader hesitated, his certainty cracking under the weight of reasonable alternatives. After 90 seconds of discussion, he nodded sharply. Eastern Bank. But we move fast once we commit. The crossing took 7 minutes instead of 3. But it was clean. No slips. No lost equipment. No panic dot from their observation point behind a cluster of pines. The two senior operators watched in silence. You were right, the operator said quietly after the last recruit reached the far side. About letting them figure it out themselves. You were right too, the trooper replied. About the Eastern Bank being safer. I was watching the water flow. You noticed the rock stability. Different angles. Same goal. They walked on, the unspoken understanding growing between them with each step. The exercise continued to test the recruits, and through them, the two leaders. When a simulated ambush pinned the group against a rocky outcrop, the GDF trainees immediately sought high ground for overwatch, while the naval trainees laid down covering fire from concealed positions. Neither approach worked alone, but together, coordinated through shouted updates and quick hand signals. They broke the ambush in under 3 minutes, during a brief rest stop as dusk settled. The trooper found himself sharing a water bottle with the operator, sitting on an overturned log as the recruits set up a temporary perimeter nearby. I watched you earlier, the trooper said, wiping his mouth. When that young GDF recruit froze during the ambush, you didn't yell. You just moved to his position, tapped his shoulder, pointed to the flank. Gave him a simple task. He snapped out of it. The operator shrugged. Fear isn't disobedience. It's human. You treat it differently. And you saw me when the navals wanted to split the group for a flanking maneuver, the trooper said. I pushed back hard. Too hard at first. But you waited me out. Let me see for myself that their plan had merit. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of recruits moving through the trees, the chirp of evening insects rising around them. I spent so long believing that showing any flexibility was weakness, the operator admitted, his voice low enough that only the trooper could hear. After my team died, I thought if I just held the line harder, followed the rules tighter, I could prevent it from happening again. But all I did was build walls. The trooper nodded slowly. And I thought rules were made to be broken when the situation demanded it. That instinct was the only thing that mattered in the moment. But instinct without foundation, that's just recklessness wearing a hero's mask. Neither man had spoken so plainly about their own flaws before, not to each other, maybe not to anyone. The admission hung between them, not as weakness, but as strength. The kind that comes from finally seeing yourself clearly enough to change dot as full darkness settled over the training ground. The recruits received their team assignments at the checkpoint. The tension was immediate, friends suddenly on opposing sides, alliances fractured in an instant. But something had shifted during the day's march. The branch divisions had softened. GDF and naval trainees who had argued over crossing points now stood shoulder to shoulder, accepting their new roles without resentment. The trooper and operator watched from a ridge above as the two newly formed teams prepared for the night phase of the exercise. One team would push toward the relay station. The other would move to defend it. They're ready, the operator said. They're not ready, the trooper corrected gently. But they're learning. That's what matters. The operator looked at him, really looked at him, in the dim light of the rising moon. We should have had this conversation years ago. Yeah, the trooper agreed. But we weren't ready either. Below them, the recruits moved out, some toward the objective, some toward defense, all carrying the day's lessons in their posture, their communication, their willingness to listen before acting. The two senior operators remained on the ridge a moment longer, not as rivals, not even as allies yet, but as two human beings who had finally stopped fighting the wrong battle. The real mission had never been about who was right on a nice moon. It had always been about whether they could find enough common ground to move forward together. Night deepened over the training grounds, the moon casting long shadows across the terrain as the two teams of recruits moved with purpose toward their objectives. The trooper and the naval operator followed at a distance, watching silently as the young soldiers applied the lessons of the day. There were no dramatic confrontations, no heroic last stands, just a steady, careful work of people learning to trust each other despite wearing different uniforms. The team assigned to capture the relay station moved with controlled aggression, using the terrain intelligently. The defenders held their ground not through brute force, but through smart positioning and constant communication. Both sides made mistakes. Both adapted. And through it all, the invisible wall between GDF and naval trainees continued to dissolve, replaced by something simpler and stronger. Shared purpose. Near midnight, the capturing team reached the outer perimeter of the relay station, a bay, cluster of weathered concrete buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence, long since rusted through in places. They moved to breach the eastern entrance, exactly as planned. But the defenders had anticipated this. A flare shot into the sky, bathing the area in harsh white light. Shouts echoed across the compound. Simulated gunfire cracked through the air, not real bullets, but the sharp reports of training rounds that stung enough to remind everyone the stakes were real. The trooper and operator watched from a ridge overlooking the compound. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. They both saw the same thing unfolding below, the capturing team falling back in good order after the ambush, regrouping behind a storage shed, quickly revising their approach. The defender who had called the ambush, a young GDF recruit, immediately radioed his position to the rest of his team, his voice calm despite the adrenaline. No gloating, no panic, just clear, precise communication. "They're learning," the operator murmured, his breath forming a faint cloud in the cool night air. "They're teaching each other," the trooper corrected softly. "Watch the woman from Naval who suggested the eastern crossing earlier. She's now coordinating with that GDF recruit who froze during the ambush. He's covering her flank while she scouts an alternate entry point." The operator watched, a slow realization dawning on his face. They're not thinking in terms of branches anymore. They're just thinking in terms of the mission. "Because we stopped modeling the division for them," the trooper said. "All day, we stood together. We disagreed quietly when we needed to. We listened." They noticed. A comfortable silence settled between them as they continued observing. The exercise played out over the next 3 hours, not with one side triumphing over the other, but with both teams eventually realizing the relay station's power core had been rigged to fail in 6 hours regardless of who controlled it. The real objective, hidden in the fine print of their orders, was to work together to stabilize the core before time ran out. When the teams discovered this twist just before dawn, there was no hesitation. Former opponents became a single unit, pooling their skills to solve the problem. The GDF trainees used their technical knowledge to diagnose the failure. The naval trainees applied their field-expedient repair techniques to jury-rig a solution. They succeeded with 17 minutes to spare. As the first light of morning touched the eastern hills, the trooper and operator walked down to meet the exhausted but triumphant recruits. The young soldiers stood together in a loose circle, gear muddy, faces smudged with dirt, but eyes bright with the quiet pride of people who had discovered something important about themselves and each other. The naval operator addressed them first. "You were given a test today. Not about tactics or marksmanship. Those matter, but they're not what separates good soldiers from great ones." He paused, letting his gaze travel across each face. "The test was whether you could set aside what divides you and focus on what unites you. You passed." The trooper stepped forward then. "Remember this feeling. The next time you're in a real situation when the stakes are life and death, when fear is real and consequences are permanent, remember that the person beside you might wear a different uniform, might think differently, might approach problems in ways that confuse you. But if you can find the common ground beneath all that, that's when you become unstoppable." He looked at the operator, then back at the recruits. "We learned that lesson alongside you. Maybe later than we should have. But we learned it." Later that morning, back at the main facility, the general found them standing together outside the debriefing building, watching the recruits file inside to submit their after-action reports. "I received the exercise summary," the general said, joining them without ceremony. The recruits exceeded expectations. More importantly, they demonstrated integration I haven't seen in joint training exercises for years. He looked at each man in turn. "Your disciplinary files have been sealed. Not erased, because what happened on Europa mattered, but sealed with a note that both parties demonstrated exceptional growth and commitment to unified command principles." Neither man spoke immediately. The weight of the words settled gently. "The real victory," the general continued, "isn't that you avoided punishment. It's that you chose to build something better from the pieces you broke. That's leadership. That's what we need more of." After the general left, the two operators stood in silence for a moment, the morning sun warming their shoulders. "I have a rotation starting next month," the operator said finally. "Deep space reconnaissance. GVF handles most of the orbital logistics for those missions." The trooper nodded slowly. "I could pull some strings. Make sure you get a competent orbital coordinator. Someone who understands that sometimes the plan needs to bend." A faint smile touched the operator's lips. "I'd appreciate that. And if your unit ever needs ground support for a planetary insertion, you know who to call." "I know," the trooper said. They didn't shake hands. They didn't clap each other on the back. Those gestures would have felt too performative, too much like the ending of a story rather than the beginning of something real. Instead, they simply stood together for a few more minutes, watching the world wake up around them, birds moving through the trees, distant vehicles humming on service roads, the slow brightening of the sky. Later that day, as the trooper packed his gear for the return journey to his posting, he found a small data chip tucked into the side pocket of his bag. No note accompanied it. He inserted it into his reader. A single file appeared: terrain maps for the deep space reconnaissance route the operator had mentioned, annotated with potential hazard zones and optimal insertion. Windows. Practical. Professional. But in the corner of one map, a small detail had been added: a reminder to check atmospheric pressure readings at the third waypoint. With a note that said "Instinct matters here," the trooper smiled, a real, unguarded smile, and tucked the chip carefully into his own gear. Not as a souvenir, as a promise. Weeks later, aboard an orbital station drifting silently above a distant moon, the trooper coordinated the insertion of a ground team through turbulent upper atmosphere winds. His fingers moved across the console with practiced ease, adjusting trajectories, monitoring life signs, calling out updates to the bridge crew. When the lead dropship reported unexpected turbulence at the third waypoint, his hand hovered over the abort command for exactly 2 seconds. Then he overrode the computer's recommendation and cleared them to continue on a modified descent path, trusting both the data and the quiet certainty in his gut that the winds would break just as the ship reached the cloud. The dropship broke through the cloud smoothly, The team touched down precisely on target. A voice crackled over the cumline comm. Familiar. Ground team secure. Thanks for the assist up there. The trooper keyed his response, his voice steady. Just following the plan. And sometimes, not. A pause. Then a soft chuckle over the static. Sometimes not. And in that simple exchange across thousands of miles of void, between two men who had once stood rigid and angry before a council, they had built something that would outlast any single mission, any disagreement, any pride. They had built trust. Not the loud, dramatic kind that makes headlines, but the quiet, enduring kind that shows up when it matters most, when beams are falling, when rivers are rising, when the next right choice isn't in the manual and someone has to decide anyway, together.